In the 18th century, in what we call the Enlightenment, we get a new source, and that's science. And science includes taxonomy, which is classification. And so in the middle of the 18th century, the father of taxonomy is Linnaeus. Well-educated Westerners, and in this case of human taxonomy, primarily Germans, so German-speaking people, decided how to classify people and where people fit in the overall taxonomy of the world. And so there were many, many different ways of doing that. So I focus on Göttingen in the western part of Germany because Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, who was the man whose classification of 5 races emerged as the most persuasive for a very long time. But Blumenbach had a colleague named Christoph Meiners, and he had a classification of people into 2, ugly and beautiful. So there are all these different ways of classifying people, depending on what the criterion or criteria were of interest or importance to you.
Hello everybody and welcome to, I believe it's episode 3 of Down with the King. Now today I am joined by someone who, I'm going to be totally honest with you, I'm amazed that I managed to get her on the channel, partly because I'm a massive fan and I haven't really hidden that from this particular person. Today I'm joined by Dr. Nell Irvin Painter. Now Dr. Painter's CV could be a novel in itself, so I'm not going to do her the disservice of trying to summarize it anywhere near its entirety. She has a degree in anthropology, a master's in African history, and a PhD in American history from Harvard University. She has a background in literature, authorship, art, education that is probably the longest I've ever seen. So it's a real privilege to have her on the channel today. One of the things about when I reached out to Dr. Painter is she got back to me straight away, and that truly amazed me. And not only that, but she took quite a lot of time to familiarize herself with the work that I do, which is really a real privilege and just shows the kind of quality of character that she has and the amount of dedication she shows to her field. Amongst many other things, Dr. Painter is the author of many books. The book that I was introduced to her work from is called The History of White People, which happens to be a New York Times bestseller. A book that didn't receive any awards, unfortunately, because of the controversial nature of its contents. She's currently completing a new biographical study. Sojourner Truth was a New Yorker, and she didn't say that. And it is an absolute honor and a pleasure to have her on the channel. Welcome to Down with the King, Dr. Painter. I'm sitting here, and to me, this is I don't know if you've heard the expression fanboying. This is a little bit of a fanboy moment for me.
Yes.
It is a bit of a fanboy moment for me because to me, you're a heavyweight scholar, and I just want to be a little bit selfish right now.
Sure.
In saying that, I don't know if you've caught up with any of my content, and it's fine if you haven't.
Yes.
But I've recently just done like a whole series on slavery, the Black Sea slave trade, and I've looked at British slavery as well. And I just want you to know that you were the catalyst for that entire series.
Terrific.
Your book, The History of White People, and the subsequent lectures that you've done were a massive eye-opener for me.
You know,
as someone who's go on.
In preparation for talking to you, I went back to the book. It's really good.
Can I say, like, and I totally empathize with that feeling that you have there, because sometimes I go back, and obviously you're a PhD in his, you're a proper historian, graduated from Harvard, all of the accolades, fantastic. What do you call a discography of books? What do you call that? A library?
Someone's bibliography?
Bibliography, that's it. Thank you.
Yes.
fantastic bibliography, and obviously lectured at Princeton, and you've got all of the accolades. So I'm not trying to compare what I do, but even me, I go back sometimes a couple of years, and I'm like, hey, that
Mhm.
was a good
Yeah,
bit of
that's really
research.
good.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so hearing you say going back to a piece that you've written,
Yeah.
how old is that now? Is it 15 years or more?
2010.
Yeah, 15
Yeah,
years.
15 years. And it
What
took
an
10
amazing
years to
book.
write. It took 10 years.
Okay, I don't doubt that. So,
Yeah.
I guess going back, and I'm going to let you shoot in a second, but I just wanted you to kind of
Sure.
know a little bit of the backdrop. I
Mhm.
always had, it's one of those things where you know something and then you put it to the back of your mind because no one ever speaks about it. And
Yeah.
I always knew that the term slavery came from the word Slav. I always knew
Yes.
there was a relation there, historical
Yes.
relation. And I think
Yes.
most people,
Yes.
in fairness, know that.
Mm.
But that's all they know. At least that's all I know. Yeah, all I knew.
Mhm.
All I knew was okay.
Mhm.
There's a relationship there between the word slave and
Mhm.
Slav, but it's not
Mhm.
that important because
Mhm.
we're told throughout our education that
Yeah.
slavery is this
Yeah.
thing that's
Ah.
exclusive or at least heavily weighted
Yeah.
towards
Yeah.
Africans.
Blackness. Yeah.
And it was your book that just, I guess it was like pulling out a thread and just opened the door to so much that we're not told. And it's not that it's not known, it's that it's just not spoken about. And since reading your book, I've been able to find other resources. So I'm going to let you shoot now. I just wanted to give you that thank you for opening my eyes to this because
Yes.
I think it's
You're so
transformative
welcome.
knowledge. It really is. I think what you've presented is transformative knowledge, and if people understand
Yeah.
how nuanced this topic is, it really does transform the way that you view the world. It was transforming for me. So my
Hmm.
first question is, and I'm going to allow you to run now and stop rambling myself. What Why did you think it was important for us to have this discussion? What motivated you to write that book, The History of White People?
It was a question. Why are white people called Caucasian? And, my books generally start with a question. I wrote my first book with a particular person in mind, a woman named Francine Wilson, who was my first graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. But after that, I just wrote for myself. And not all of the things I wanted to write for myself have turned into books. So, for instance, I wanted to write a book on personal beauty, and that never became a book. But by and large, what I wanted to do, other people thought, oh, yeah, that's kind of interesting. We could do a book about that. So it started with a question, and I have never written with the sense of I want people to understand this in the way that I put it out. It's more, here's some things I find really interesting, and here's how I found out. And let's hope that you enjoy the reading.
The the book itself kind of presents some information that a lot of people aren't going to be aware about.
That's right.
We can talk about the odor list, but let's go from the very start actually, because
Okay.
sometimes even me, I get into my rabbit hole of things that I want to concentrate on. But at the very start, you've just reminded me about something in the book that perhaps we need to touch on, and that's the origins of race itself. This kind of idea of
Yes,
taking mankind and classifying them into
that's
these
right.
groups.
That's
Can you
right.
just take us through a little
Okay.
bit of what you see as the development of the races as we know them now?
Yes. So the races as we know them now, that's part of human knowledge. And it's also part of scientific knowledge. Scientific meaning that you don't have to belong to the particular tribe to believe it, that everybody could believe it because it's basically true. And before the Enlightenment, before the 18th century, the way that people in the Western world, I dare not generalize to the rest of the world, but I think it may also be true, that source was religion. So in Western society and Christian society, I'm writing about this right now, actually, about Sojourner Truth. The idea of truth comes from the Bible. That's the source. And for centuries, for Westerners, that was the source of truth, the Bible. In the 18th century, in what we call the Enlightenment, we get a new source, and that's science. And science includes taxonomy, which is classification. And so, in the middle of the 18th century, the father of taxonomy is Linnaeus. Um, Well-educated Westerners, and in this case of human taxonomy, primarily Germans, so German-speaking people, decided how to classify people and where people fit in the overall taxonomy of the world. And so there were many, many different ways of doing that. So I focus on Göttingen in the western part of Germany because Jan Friedrich Blumenbach, who was the man whose classification of 5 races emerged as the most persuasive for a very long time. But Blumenbach had a colleague named Christoph Meiners, and he had a classification of people into two, ugly and beautiful. So there are all these different ways of classifying people depending on the what the criterion or criteria were of interest or importance to you. So, for instance, I'm talking to you from northern New York State, and where are you?
I'm in London.
Okay, and you're in London. So, our classification of the races might be geographical.
Mm.
So, the people in London are a certain sort of people. So, they're all bearded and wear hats. And the people in northern New York State have stuff on their floors. So it depends on, people would ask me, well, I know we know all this sort of stuff about classification, but what's really race? How do you really decide on race? And I would always say it depends on who's talking, to whom, for what purpose,
Yeah.
when, and where.
That's such an amazing answer because you know what? I had a little bit of an epiphany yesterday. I can't remember who I was speaking to, but they were from America and the subject of race came up. And maybe it was a comment I was interacting with. And they mentioned that the races to them are white, black, Asian, and Hispanic. And I was like, those four classifications are very American.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't
yeah.
even have Hispanics over here in the UK. So it has
You
no,
probably
it
have
doesn't
what we
exist.
call Hispanics, but you
Yeah,
call them something else.
yeah, exactly. But
Yeah,
but even like that kind of unique makeup of these
yeah,
slightly
yeah,
African, slightly European, you know, maybe
yeah.
sometimes even slightly indigenous people who have made this group that's called Latino. That's a
Hmm.
almost uniquely American
And
classification.
it's situated in time
Mm,
because in the early mid 20th century, there was no such classification.
mm. And how recent is that?
Let's
And we've seen,
see. Latino, Hispanic, I don't know when it enters the US Census, which is so many Americans think of as truth in racial
mm,
classification, when in fact it is a policy document that changes
mm,
every 10 years. And in 2000, we had a new classification called ethnicity. So there was Hispanic, and there was um, Hispanic was not a race, it was an ethnicity.
Mm,
And that has changed in subsequent censuses. But the whole question about what is a race and what is an ethnicity, that changes over time. And nobody
mm.
can really tell the difference.
Wow. You know, it makes me think about how complex this subject of race is. I think particularly in America, across the world, but I think in
Yeah.
America it shifts so much, and it's almost like race is an emergent thing. Races can emerge, like you said, for a period of time, but then you could come back in 50 to 100 years time, that racial classification no longer exists, and as a result
Well,
of the
you don't have to
yeah.
wait that long. It changes every 10 years. And
Wow.
one reason you know so much about American race is that Americans have been tracking race for 200 plus years.
Mm,
Whereas in France, for instance, I think it's still illegal to track people by race.
mm,
So it depends on the society. How do you want to classify people? And one of the things that always interested me about Britain is that it seemed that the weight of class was so much more important than in the
mm,
United States, where the weight falls on race. Of
mm.
course, race in the United States is highly imbricated with class.
Different people have got different ideas, because I want to just, since we're talking about this subject of race, I want to just pick your brain as a PhD in history about the origins of, and I'm going to say modern, the origins of modern racism, because there's lots of different theories that
Yeah,
people
two
have.
different things, though. Two different things.
Okay, go on.
Racism
Yeah.
is real. Racism
Yes.
is about policies, it's about discrimination, it's about what affects people in class terms, geographically, and so forth.
Yeah.
Race is a concept. It's the concept at the basis of racism, but
Mm,
racism is material, whereas
mm,
race is conceptual.
absolutely. So yeah, I guess to build on that, I wanted to get your ideas about its origins, because I've done a little bit of research, and I guess my mind's settling at the moment. A lot of people cite the event called Bacon's Rebellion
Oh,
as a
yes.
kind of a starting point, because then you saw some of the first laws
Sure.
written in which gave the white race advantage over the other races,
At
so
that
to
point,
speak.
the English, yeah. No, that
So
goes back
I'm going to
to
hand
a
over to you. Yeah,
very
what do you
influential,
think?
yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Um, that is comes from a very influential book by a very influential uh, historian whose name I'll have to go back and dig out of my memory. But the that idea, which, as you say, is very influential, is rooted in a particular book at a particular time. And I'm pretty sure that book came out in the 1960s. So before that time, the notion of Bacon's rebellion as race making didn't yet exist.
Mm,
It's been very influential because it makes a lot of sense. And it also points to um, documents, legal documents that we can look at and trace. Um, I don't see a watershed in that clear sense, but I am not a historian of the colonial period in North America. Um, I see things happening in very many different ways in different times in different places. And so if you look, Bacon's Rebellion is in Virginia, but if you look in Massachusetts, for instance, you might see something different.
mm.
Um, but I would not discredit the idea of Bacon's Rebellion as a watershed in racial classification in North America.
Okay. Do you have any opposing views, or maybe complementary views in terms
Well, how
of
about
the
additional
development. Yeah, yeah,
views?
additional.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
And so I would look at demography, you know, how many people you have where and what they do and how long they live and what they produce and so forth. And by the turn of the 18th century, the demography changes so that in the 17th century, the peopling of British North America, what became British North America, there would have been large numbers of native peoples still,
Mm,
who usually don't figure in the classification, but they were there. The workforce producing commodities, which is what we look at, and we're talking about tobacco, that workforce was overwhelmingly European. A lot of English people, Irish people, Scots people. Um, by the turn of the 18th century, the the growth of the Atlantic slave trade tips the demography and now we're talking Virginia in the southern states, tips the demography away from European workers and toward African workers.
mm.
And so there we get the need to classify people tipping also toward African descended people.
I guess I'm gonna dig a little bit further before we move on from this topic, because obviously your book touches on this, and I think one of the things you mentioned is about kind of these shiploads of European children coming
Yeah.
over and being coupled with the Africans to work in indentured servitude.
Hmm.
I guess I wanted to kind of understand what do you feel was that tipping or turn? I know you've already said it's kind of state by state, but are
Hmm.
there any notable events that stand out in your mind that could have shifted the shifted the kind of like the
The
sentiment
demographics.
towards, yes, exactly, well, yeah, or the demographics, as you said,
Yes.
yes,
And
yeah, yeah.
that was the virtual industrialization of the Atlantic slave trade.
Mm,
Um, there was an Atlantic slave trade in the 17th century. It got kicked up and rationalized in that awful monetary sense in the 18th century. So the numbers, the sheer numbers of people, I mean, it was an industry. And I've always, and I didn't always say, but I say now, and I have for some years said that the Atlantic slave trade belongs to business history, not race history. For one thing, we've talked about the concept of race. I mean, you can monetize race in some ways, but if you look at the Atlantic slave trade in business terms, then you see suppliers, you
mm,
see warehouses, you see finances, you see all kinds of arrangements that we recognize as business.
mm,
And it you can't separate the business participants by race. I mean, you can because we
mm,
do, but they're suppliers whom we would call Black. There are commodities, people whom we call Black, and there are shippers whom we would call white. So, in a way, you can racialize that, but you get into trouble when you realize that the suppliers are African people, just as the suppliers in the Caucasus or Ukraine were what we now call European people. But suppliers work on what pays, not
mm.
what sounds good in terms of race.
That's very interesting.
Well,
Okay, let's.
I find it very interesting because in the United States, um, I understand the yearning for a larger identity than African for people of African descent because there has been
mm,
so much injustice. There has been so much bloodshed, violence,
mm,
terrorism. I call that American history. For
mm,
Black history, I look at people who were creating. And my narrative history of Black Americans is called Creating Black
mm.
Americans. So the business's history I think of not as Black American history. The business history rooted in African suppliers, I don't think of as Black history. I think of it as business, international business history around supply chains and financial arrangements.
One of the things that like I said, I've recently put out a series
Yeah.
where we talk about some of these subjects,
Mhm.
and I get a lot of resistance. And I know you touched on this as
Yes,
well, and I
yes,
definitely want to
yes,
get some. There's a lot of pushback, but I'm going to tell you one of
there
the
is.
the pushbacks that I do get, and I expected it, which is why I guess I've been reluctant in or been very reticent in the way that I've released this series, is people really take ownership of this idea of slavery because we've
Yes,
been taught it from a very young age. So
yes.
black people feel like we own the
We own
the
slavery.
real estate, yeah, the real estate of slavery, and they
Yeah,
feel almost like saying other people were slaves
yeah.
is an
It's
attack.
taking something
Yeah,
away.
exactly. From which
Yeah,
first of all, I have to be empathetic, and I
yeah.
can't, because I one of the things I always say is I'm Nigerian, and
Uh,
I'm a Brit, I'm Nigerian, and I one thing I don't do is I never try to appropriate what I see as the African American or the Black American experience.
hmm hmm
I think it's something unique. And actually, I get really irritated, and it might not annoy you, but I do get very irritated when Black people go into America from different places from the diaspora and they're labeled as Black Americans or African Americans. And I'm like, no, you can't really do that because there's a historical legacy here that you have to respect.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't just go to America and become a Black American,
yeah,
even if I have
yeah.
children there. Like that, I have to be a part of that historical legacy. Just the same
Yes,
way a Black
yes.
person can't just come to Nigeria and become a Yoruba. You have to
Some try, some
yeah.
try.
You have to respect the legacy that goes before. So I'd
Yeah,
never kind of undermine it. But there is this thing where there's this protectiveness over slavery, and they feel like
yes,
they're being
yes.
attacked when you mention, and it's like, no, we at least in my mind, we have to understand that this narrative, which is a initially white, let's say Caucasian. Well, I won't say white. Let's say Caucasian, which seems to be initially heavily weighted in the Caucasian region, then became a bit more worldwide, and then became very heavily concentrated in Africa. It's good for us to understand this evolution of this slave trade because
I,
it's
I,
not
I want
something
to
that.
disagree with
Go on.
you a little bit
Oh,
in your
please, yeah, please.
chronology. For me, slavery is something that happens all over the world.
Mm,
What makes a difference are the business arrangements that affect the scale. So, for instance, in the Black Sea slave trade, which we've been talking about, the
mm,
scale was pretty big. The
mm,
merchants were Greek, and they were shipping people from um, Crimea to the Eastern Mediterranean. And we're
mm,
talking thousands, tens of thousands of people. By
mm,
the time we get to the 18th century, and we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, the scale is so much greater.
mm,
And I think that's what makes the big difference. So the business history is of enormous scale. We're talking millions of people now. And I remember I lived in Ghana for 2 years in the 1960s. And There was some talk. I was at the University of Ghana, so we had very high level conversations, and so often I would hear from, I can't say African colleagues because I was just a student, that there either was no slavery before the Atlantic slave trade in West Africa, or it was very different, it was benign, it was household. And then for a project that I may work on after I finish my current Sojourner Truth book, um, it's about how living abroad changed how I talk about the world and write about the world. I went back to some African Americans who were in West Africa in the 19th century. And they talk about slave markets and it's again kind of a business. It's a
Mm,
smaller scale business, but there was slavery in West Africa during, before, and I don't want to talk about after, but certainly during and before the Atlantic slave trade. The difference is the scale and
mm,
the rationalization of the business. So, whereas before the 18th century, um, people who were on the periphery, kind of like in Ukraine and the Caucasus, they were subject to raids. Sometimes they sold their children because the family was hungry, rather smaller scale. And people were basically household servants and wives. I won't get into the distinction or non-distinction between wives and slaves. But so there was slavery, but the difference in the Atlantic slavery is the rationalization of the business of the trade. And I remember in the 90s when the Balkans were on fire, and I remember saying to myself and to others that if there had been a market, there would have been um, a very active slave trade in the Aegean Sea, uh, in the Adriatic, because there was so much disruption and so much warfare that produces, ooh, I hate to say this, but that produces slavery.
mm,
So there was not at that time a market, a big market. In the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly the 18th century, there was a market in the Caribbean and in the American South.
mm.
And so that spurred the rationalization of the supply chain.
Let me ask you another question. I think this one is going to perhaps be a bit more. Actually, you might answer really straight or might be a bit more challenging. Have
Uh-huh.
you ever felt the or had pushback in terms of the scale? Because I think one thing that you're communicating quite clearly is that the
Sure.
scale was very large. And I guess
Yeah.
me as a Nigerian, West African, um, we've always had trouble, and I particularly have had trouble consolidating the published numbers with
Mhm.
the local oral history, and
Hmm.
also with the local
Tell me,
ethnicities
tell me more. What do the local oral histories say?
in regards to the numbers,
Yeah,
that they're a lot less. So we can't find. I guess I've found it hard to locate these missing millions in terms of, because people, like everyone, like there's a lot of people who think they descend from Yoruba, and I'm like, well, that's great, but
sure. Why not?
you could do. I'm Yoruba, by the
Oh,
way,
yeah.
and I'm like,
Uh-huh.
well, you could descend from Yoruba.
Yeah.
And I think that's a vast majority. A lot of people think they either Yoruba and Igbo, but then
Yeah.
being present amongst Yoruba and Igbo, I'm looking for that large depopulation event that probably needed to have taken place to support the kind of numbers that we're
Ah,
seeing in the Americas. And
Well,
I'm finding it
yeah,
very hard
yeah,
to
yeah,
find these events.
yes, yes. And that's because the vulnerable people who got shipped didn't come from the coasts. They came from the hinterland of people who didn't have kings to protect them. They were also, people make a lot of people. So only now are we worrying about depopulation and women not having enough children and so forth. Um, Women can have 10, 15 children. So you can lose a lot of people and still not have a demographic collapse. But I
Mm.
remember, I'm going to tell you a story about my own life and my own mother. I had wonderful parents, and I went with them to Ghana. And my mother had a houseboy named, we thought, Adongo. And my mother wrote a marvelous, it was her second book, a memoir called I Hope I Look That Good When I'm That Old. My mother was a gorgeous woman who looked great forever. And people told
So I
her
can
that
just
when
pause you
she
there
was
really
young.
quickly. You said you had a houseboy. Was
Yes,
that in
wait a minute,
in
I'm
Africa?
coming back to that. I'm coming
Okay,
back to
sorry.
that. But I have to tell you about my mother and her memoir because what we found out came when my mother was writing her book. So my mother was talking about being in Ghana. My parents loved it. I loved it too. Um, but Kwame Nkrumah got deposed and all us uh, commies had to leave. But at any rate, so my mother had a houseboy named Adongo, and he was a northerner. And most of the real, the houseboy kind of people, domestic servants and so forth, were northerners. It was a much poorer area than southern Ghana. And it turned out, as we were researching him and his name, that Adongo means slave. So we had to change his name, obviously, in the
Mm.
memoir. But that that keyed us, excuse me, that keyed us into where the people came from, or some of the people came from who got caught in the maw of slavery, whether domestic or international. These are people from the hinterland. They don't have armies, they don't have protection. And the armies of the kings, because I mean, what are kings but big, powerful warlords? They would go up and round up hapless peasants in Europe, in the Caucasus, in Ukraine, in Russia, in that area which did not have kings. Um, the Cossacks, who were the suppliers around the suppliers in the 18th, 17th century of the Black Sea Strait. These were people who were armed, and they would go every now and then. They called it harvesting the steppe being this agricultural area of
Mm.
poor peasants. They would harvest the steppe. They would just round up poor peasants and ship them off. The same system worked in Africa. I mean, it probably worked in Asia. I know it worked in Asia. It is not a race bound system, it's a political, economic system in which the warriors and the warlords collect people and sell them.
Thank you. That brings a lot of clarity to that question. I guess before we move on, just to expand on that answer you give me there,
Mhm.
what then has been the major difference? Because in my mind, you've got one major slave trade, which perhaps didn't have the concentration of numbers in that small amount of time, because it's a relatively short amount of time, the Atlantic slave trade in comparison to the Caucasian one. But
Yeah.
what we have with the Caucasian slave trade is we have a
Let's
very,
call it
it
the
seems like a
Black
very
Sea slave trade,
consistent.
because it was more than the Caucasus. It
Okay,
was also into what we call Ukraine and southern Russia. So yeah, it was the Black Sea slave trade. Yes.
Black Sea slave trade.
Yeah.
We have what seems to be a much longer lasting one. I think you said
Yes.
that it goes
Yes.
back at
Millennia.
least two and a
Yeah.
half thousand years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and a lot of that slavery has resulted in a lot of those people ending up in and around the North African region, in and around the Mediterranean, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's what do you think has been the big difference in that? Looking at, I guess, the political situation that we find,
Not political,
the
economic. Economic.
economic,
It's
the
the
business
market.
situation.
It is
um,
the market.
yeah,
The
but I guess
market in the
the post. Yeah,
Caribbean
go on.
to produce sugar. And I mean, there was sugar production in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, you
Uh,
speak about
and yeah, the workers included enslaved workers. There were enslaved workers, there were serfs, there were free workers. It was a very mixed workforce. But the market for labor was of an entirely different magnitude in the 18th century, 17th and 18th, particularly the 18th century for sugar in the Caribbean.
the sugar production in the Caribbean. Um, Eventually was going to be outperformed by the European beet sugar production,
Yes, yes,
which I guess was a catalyst to what ended up being abolition in
yes, yes,
at
yes.
least in the case of Britain,
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true.
amongst
It's
other things.
true. Germany, France. Yeah, yes, it's true. What you're saying is true.
Okay, that's good. So in that being the case, we I look at the period and the timeline. That's something, or at least that experiment, that business experiment, is something that's closed not quite a long time ago. In terms of we're talking about over 100 years ago. That actual trade, the human trafficking, that's come to a close, and yet we see
Certainly,
a
that
residual.
particular one has come to a
Yeah,
close.
that particular one. But I guess we
Yeah.
see a residual impact in our modern dynamics, that
Yes.
perhaps
Yes.
the Black
Yes.
Sea slaves, or
Yeah.
the descendants of the Black Sea slaves, aren't seeing that in
That's
North
right.
Africa. Perhaps what we're experiencing in
Yeah.
the diaspora and different
Yes.
places.
Yes.
That's what I was getting at when I said, what's
Yes.
the major difference there? Why is there this hangover, so to speak, of the effects of the slave trade? Why isn't it just, okay, it's over now, and how can't we just
Well,
move on?
as you're talking, I'm thinking about history, and uh, for the Atlantic slave trade was such a human atrocity that it caused political change and it got outlawed. So that's the big difference. Now, also, I'm thinking about the Maghreb, for instance. You mentioned the Mediterranean. And because of French colonialism, people of, I was going to say European descent, or people who looked like they were of European descent,
Mm,
um, got made into a class above the local people, the Muslim population. So French colonialism created a group of people. They were called Pieds Noirs, Blackfeet. They were people of indeterminate background, a lot of Italian background, Jewish background. Um, and people who were Jewish, say from the Middle East, got slotted into the class above the indigenous people. So, we have a two-tier system in which the indigenous people are subjugated, and then there's this heterogeneous group of people who function as French. So it's history, it's politics, it's even ethics, because it
Mm.
was the ethics, not the business of the Atlantic slave trade. It was the ethics, it was the inhumanity of it that got it outlawed.
That's so interesting. Is it an oversimplification to call it a global system of white supremacy?
Yes. I mean, if you, it depends on why you're doing that. That is
Mm.
not for me useful, but there are other people who have other rhetorical ends and might find it useful. Um, I would stumble over, who are you calling white? You know?
Okay, so I'm gonna take us back a little bit now. Thank you, by the way. It's all excellent answers as I'd expect. I'm gonna take us back a little bit because I think you're currently doing art now. You've had a little bit of a
Yes,
shift. So how much?
yes.
Let me know if this becomes daunting because I'm getting you to go back to maybe something you haven't touched on for such a long time. But I love the fact that I've just done obviously just a bit of brief research. And I love the fact that you've done your. It's like you've brought some of that history into your artwork, and I actually did manage to
Yes.
find one of your pieces online, your odalisque map,
Oh,
which
yes.
I found
Yes.
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the
My art is on my website. You can find tons of it there. You don't
oh
have to go
amazing.
looking at, yeah.
Okay, okay, brilliant. I hope you don't mind if I display some of these during
Oh,
when I
not at
post this
all.
up.
Not at all.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. So I've got a question to ask you about the odalisque map. Okay.
Hmm.
So I think, first of all, how is it received? And I know it's art, so I'm not going to ask for an over explanation. I'm more going to ask for more of your perspective. How is it
Yes.
received, perhaps, from people who don't appreciate the historical relevance or even
Ah,
know about who the odalisque are?
well, that was a piece I made when I was in art school. So it has never been exhibited.
Okay.
The only people who see it are people who go to my website or find it in ways that you found it. So it doesn't have a reception history. Um, and with my art, actually with my historical writing as well, reception is not in my mind.
Okay.
So, for instance, right now I'm writing a new book on Sojourner Truth. I published a book on a biography of Sojourner Truth in the 1990s. And Sojourner Truth has changed since then. For one thing, when I published, there were no statues for Sojourner Truth. There were no monuments. There are probably at least 6 or 8 now. The first one came up after I published it. It's in Sacramento, California, by the distinguished artist Elizabeth Catlett. But so Sojourner Truth has changed, and the way I can write history has changed. So I'm writing a new book on Sojourner Truth called Sojourner Truth Was a New Yorker, and she didn't say that. So I will include my own artwork, but I'm writing this book and I'm spending a lot of time with Adventism. Do you know what I'm talking about? The
No.
idea that the world is going to come to an end pretty soon.
Okay.
This was really important for Sojourner Truth at one point. And so I'm getting all involved in this. And her religion in the 1830s and 1840s, for me, riveting. I'm not a religious person, But, I just find it absolutely fascinating. So I've said to my husband, I'm the only person who's probably going to like this book. I'm writing this book for me because I find it so important and fascinating. Luckily, it's already contracted, so it's going to appear. We'll see if anybody else likes it but me. But that's kind of how I've always operated. I told you that I had these wonderful parents, and they never drove me to do this, that, or the other, or made me feel that I would be impoverished if I didn't do this, that, or the other. So I have been
Mm.
not completely free. Nobody's completely free. And especially as a Black American woman of a certain age, no, of an old age, I have not been completely free. But I have been free of the obvious impediments related to money. Uh, and so I have been free to pursue my own interest and write as I wish. I am so grateful for that.
I think that's an amazing gift, and I think it
It
reflects
is.
in,
It is a
yeah,
gift.
and I think it reflects in the fact that you've, um, I was going to use the word bravery, but I didn't want to sound condescending. But the fact
People
it's
say that all the time. Oh, you're
yeah,
so brave. I
yeah,
say, no,
yeah.
I'm self-indulgent.
But it's yeah, it's kind of two sides of the same coin, because in some ways, obviously, I look at it, so the fact that you've got someone who, you know very esteemed, graduate from Harvard, professor, teaches in Princeton, and then to make a complete and utter career pivot into art.
Yeah, yeah.
That's I find stuff like that just mind-bogglingly brave. I can't. I don't like
No,
to use the word brave,
yes,
but it's
I
like
understand. Yeah, I understand when people say brave. And
mm,
I've heard it so often, and I hear from so many people who say, how can I do it also? So um, in 2018, I published my own memoir called Old in Art School,
yeah,
and a memoir of starting over. And just recently, I put on my Instagram page a photograph. Can you see behind me? See the books on the
yep,
table?
yeah,
Yeah,
really
I
make
just
it.
set that up. And so I took a picture of it and put it on Instagram, a better picture than what you've got here, because you see all the mess around it. And I said, I've set up my Adirondack writing space. And one of the comments that came back was a woman who said she was so glad to know that I was writing more about Sojourner Truth. She was reading the first Sojourner Truth and finding it very interesting. And she said that the first book of mine that she read was Old in Art School, and she called it a gateway drug to the work of Nell Painter. You were talking
Oh,
about
so
art school. Yeah,
yes.
and so people who say, I'm really interested in art, how should I go about it? And if you're really a neophyte, I say start by pursuing in community colleges. There are community colleges all over the United States,
Mm,
and most of them are either free or very cheap. So, you can pursue um, your interest without
mm,
going into bankruptcy. Whereas if you want to go to art school, you will either go into bankruptcy or spend up your patrimony. Art school is insanely expensive, and the degree you get will not make any money. Uh, so it's pretty much self-indulgent. Um, but I was fortunate enough to have the money and to have a husband who supported me 100%. Not my, I mean, my parents were still alive then, and I owed a lot of time and emotional labor to them, which I did, yeah. But they did not need me financially. I did not have any little children who needed me financially. And so I was in a very fortunate position. Um, and I knew that. People say, why did you go to art school? And I say, because I wanted to and I could.
Very inspiring for me personally. I, I I do like to make a lot of pivots. So I think we're kind of kindred in that regard. But yeah,
Yeah.
just it's just inspiring to watch. Yeah, someone like you just move into a new field. I did actually watch a lecture you gave at Bowdoin College, which is a
Voting. Yeah.
really yeah
Hmm.
Bowdoin, and that was a really amazing discussion that you had there. I want to touch on one of the things that you raised because you said that African studies were the playground of white men. And when you said
I'm
it, I
sorry.
laughed.
African studies what?
Was the playground of white men.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
when you said it, I laughed. And I laughed because my wife graduated from SOAS, School of Oriental and African
Oh, yes.
Studies in London,
Yes. Yes, I
famous
know
college,
it.
as you know.
Yeah.
So when I was growing up, or at least when I was kind of like around university age, and
Yeah.
everyone had the same outlook. SOAS is like this liberal place where you get all of the, different, very ethnically blended and lots of
Yeah.
different culture going on. And you can do a degree, which is, computer science and Yoruba and something like that. So
Yeah.
it's got all of that really nice cultural blend.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then when you do the history, which I'm sure you're aware of, you realize that it was set up to train
Yes.
colonists
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes.
imperialists.
Yes.
Like that was
Yes.
its purpose. So
Yeah.
we've got this thing that is, in the modern day, it's good that it's there. It's a University of London. It spreads culture. But then
Yeah.
when you look at its origins, its origins were a part of the British Empire's expansion
Yes.
policies.
Yes. Yes.
um, and I thought of that. That just came to my mind when you made that statement about the ownership of African studies
Sure.
by in academia, so to speak,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, being something that's very much their domain that they've been able to say what they like about and talk about from their
Mhm.
perspective for the
Yeah.
longest
And
amount of time.
how to administer the empire. But
Mm,
the histories are different in the US and the UK.
mm,
Um, and when talked about African history as the purview of white men, I was talking academic politics.
mm,
And so African American studies, as you know, came out of struggle and
mm,
came out of political history. And it's younger than African studies. So
mm,
African studies was supposedly the intellectual side,
mm,
untainted by the politics of American life. And so there were real struggles in the 70s and 80s over turf, over academic turf in American universities between the older subject and its people and the younger subject and its peoples. But I should also tell you about SOAS. I spent probably about a month as a graduate student at SOAS.
wow.
This was in the 60s. And and I left because I was in love.
I'm going to ask you to carry on. You can't just stop there.
No. I'll just leave it right there.
Left us on a cliffhanger there. So, did you want to say anything else about the I guess the because in that lecture, I think you were talking about obviously Africana studies and African American studies and African studies. One being the older, the African American studies being the
Yes,
newer. Do you
yes.
feel like there's a kind? Do you feel like there's like I guess I'm going to say this from my perspective, and it might
Sure.
help, yeah, contextualize it.
Mm-hmm.
As a black scholar,
Mm-hmm.
if I decide to study any African civilization outside of the Eurocentric framework
Mm-hmm.
and offer a more, yeah, a more kind of like nuanced approach, I would say, where I
Mm-hmm.
kind of like take into account all of the other areas of kind of
Mm-hmm.
history that have been ignored,
Mm-hmm.
I will,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm black, I will instantly get labeled an Afrocentric.
Yeah.
So that label instantly get placed upon me. It's nothing, I
Yeah,
can't
I
do anything
understand
that
that.
I've realized. It's
Yeah.
gonna be applied to me.
Yeah.
Um, and it's almost like an automatic application.
Right.
Is there do you feel there's like a similar, I guess, pigeonholing that is experienced in your field of study where it's, you know, maybe you're a black person studying or in the study of African studies, but it's called African American studies because
Mm-hmm.
you're a black person in America and you're studying
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
Does that is
Yeah.
that a thing?
Yes. 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 I recognize
Mm,
what you're talking about. Um, and I would add to that we started talking about my book, The History of White People. Um, and when I was working on that book, and for many, many years later, people didn't understand why a scholar who was black would write a book about white people.
mm,
And the reservations came not just from white people, but also from black people who felt that as a black scholar, there was so much that needed to be written about black people that that's where I should have been putting my efforts. Now, I have written several books about black people, but
mm,
the demand doesn't have a quota on it. It's not like, oh, you could write 3 books about black people and then you've done your time and you can write about anything else. No,
mm.
it's like everything you write has to be about black people.
Mm.
And so I recognize that from many sides. However, one of the great things about being old is no longer giving a shit.
That's wonderful. I do get the sneaky suspicion because obviously I've seen your lectures from like 15 years ago, and I do get
Yeah.
the sneaky suspicion that you've never given a shit though. I feel like you've
Um,
always done what you felt was
uh,
right at the time.
Yeah, from the beginning, and goes back to my parents. I did not feel um, bound. I felt that there were intellectual that I wanted to contribute to Black history. So, for instance, I did junior year abroad in Bordeaux in France, and I loved medieval history. And
Mm,
my teacher, maybe she was my TA because she was my age. I mean, she's still alive. She's still my age. Um, Carolyn Bynum, we got along very well, and she loved the way I thought, and I loved the way she thought, and I loved her field. And I said if I hadn't been a Black American, I would be in her field. And then we joked that after 25 years, we would switch fields, which of course we did not do. But so I felt that I wanted to make a contribution, an intellectual contribution to what we think of as Black studies, Black history, African American studies, and so forth, because not because it had been neglected. Many, many people had contributed, but the fruits of their labor were often hidden away because the journals they published in were not widely circulated, like the Journal of Negro History, which still exists as Journal of African American History. They Their scholarship was not known, and there was so much more to say. I mean, the more research we do, the more research there is to do. So it
Mm,
never ends.
mm,
But I feel, as I said earlier, that Sojourner Truth has changed. And that's true about Black history in general, or Black studies
mm,
in general, that there's a much wider recognition now than there was in the 20th century. And
mm,
so, even if some ungenerous people lump you in a way that you know is not doing you a favor, as a Black writer or a Black intellectual,
mm.
there will be a publisher out there to publish your stuff. So, you can tell them you don't give a shit and go on and publish your stuff. And that was not the case in the 20th century.
It's, I mean, I'm not surprised that you've had resistance, I guess, from people saying as a black person you shouldn't be writing this book.
Mhm.
But surely, as time's gone on, how much is the history of white people? Is it, because to me this is an important part, and this is going to sound weird, but I think this book should formulate part of curriculums around Africana studies. I think we have,
Yes.
I don't know, I think we have to understand this to understand our
The world.
our position in
The
history
world.
better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I always hoped that Black people would read this as about Blackness,
Mm,
because the intellectual processes are about race. They're not just about whiteness.
mm,
And I don't think that has happened. The first people who widely took it up were Black readers who
mm,
recognized that thinking in a less hidebound way about race was a good thing,
mm,
and that a book about white people belongs in Black studies. That happened. Um, there was a lot of embarrassment about the book when it came out, so it didn't win any prizes, for instance, which is just atrocious.
mm,
Um, and it's kind of still both an under and overground classic, in the sense that it has been a New York Times bestseller, and
mm,
it still sells very, very robustly, but it is not in the canon. And I think
mm,
it's because I am a Black writer, a Black woman
mm,
writer. Um, I'll give you an example, not about this book, but about Sojourner Truth, um,
mm.
and about a book that has gotten me in trouble because I say Sojourner Truth did not say, "Aren't I a woman?" or "Ain't I a woman?" And I mean, that's in the title of the new book that I'm writing now. Um, but you know who I'm talking about when I say Sojourner Truth?
No, I was literally going to ask you to,
Yeah,
for the
that,
layman, give a bit of
yes.
a
No,
background.
you're in another
Layman
country.
being me.
No, if you were in the United States, you would at least recognize the name, maybe for the wrong reasons, but you would recognize the name of great 19th century American, an abolitionist, a feminist, and someone who was talking about it for 30 years. So, a great American. Um, a great American who is known for saying, "Ain't I a woman?" Which is a corruption of "Aren't I a woman?" which
Mm,
is the invention of a white woman journalist. So I said, Sojourner Truth didn't say, "Ain't I or aren't I a woman?" And all hell broke loose, because it was like I was taking away Sojourner Truth. People who knew nothing about this woman except
mm.
this slogan. I mean, people assume that Sojourner Truth was a Southerner because she had been enslaved. So my new book is Sojourner Truth was a New Yorker. So um, but people got really angry with me about that. And
Mm.
the premier um, book review for books by women, the Women's Book Review, refused to review it.
Wow.
So I've made a lot of people, I've annoyed a lot of people, but I'm still here.
Well, I'm glad you are, first of all, but I think you've got I think you've got a knack for, and this isn't me being sycophant, by the way, but I do think you've got a knack for you. I made this compliment to you when I was on the phone with you a couple of days ago when we first
Yeah.
spoke, and I said you've. It's hard to contextualize it, but it's basically you've got this message, underlying message that I feel you want to convey, and you'll convey it, but you'll do it in the most um agreeable and objective and
Uh-huh.
factual way
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
one hopes that it has to be received. But at the same time, I know that the message that you're bringing here is very contentious. This isn't. There's no way
Uh,
they're gonna open arms just accept this revision to the
yeah. Yeah.
narrative that
Yeah. Yeah.
slavery is the domain of the black race. This is something that I feel Europeans find a great comfort in, and your
And
book
Black
in
people
many
too,
ways,
as we've been
yeah,
saying,
and black people as well, but
it's
I think
part
it's
of
more
Black
trauma
identity.
comfort.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's this historical narrative that everyone is just okay with now, which is kind of like, okay, we
No, I
we
don't
accept
think
our
so. I
position.
mean, I have a lot of trouble with everyone. Um,
Mm,
and I've said to people over and over again, I cannot go along with any generalization about uh, Black American experience that starts with the,
mm,
because we are millions of people.
mm,
And as you point out, since the last quarter century, a large percentage of what we call Black people, or who we call Black people in America, are either themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants, and their experience is very different. Their historical experience is very different.
mm.
So there is not a the Black America, and there's not a the American. So, yeah, there are a lot of people I piss off, but there are a lot of
Mm.
people I don't piss off. And I have 5,000 followers on Instagram. So
Should have a
I
lot
get
more.
my word out.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm mega fan, so yeah, I think you should have a lot more. Um, yeah, no, that's great. Let's rewind a little bit actually, because the topic of odorless is one that I think you kind of
Yes.
brought
Yes.
to the floor quite well, and made it a really massive talking point. And we're going to expand on that, but I do want to pick out something, and I felt like it was a repeating theme in your book. Was whenever these kind of, I don't know what you call these people, if you call them, original anthropologists or the first race scientists, whatever you want to call them, there always seem to be this kind of intrinsic link to their lust, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
I think you spoke
Yeah.
about, I think it was Bernier, Bernier,
Bernier. Yeah.
yeah,
Bernier.
Bernier, and
Yeah.
all even Blumenbach. There always was this underlying sexual
Yeah.
narrative when it came to the
Absolutely.
classifications of race. Like, what is that all
Absolutely.
about?
Well, we're talking about men who were writing, for one thing. And we're talking about a classification in science, their classification in their science, which was beauty. Uh, so, this science is rooted in the
Mm.
culture that they came out of. And they were men writing in a intensely misogynistic era.
I mean, one would hope that it would cause people to revise our perspectives on these things. You're always hoping that it's like we live in a time now, and then excellent researchers like you will uncover stuff like this. And I guess my hope, which is overly optimistic, is that then this will cause us to revise some of our viewpoints and our
Yeah,
positions on these things,
it
seeing that
has.
they've
It has. People
good.
don't write about odalisque in the same way now, but we're talking about a handful of people who were writing about
Mm.
these issues. I mean, I wasn't the only person who discovered this. And so art history now is very different from art history a generation ago, partly because of my work, but also because of hundreds of other art historians who are now women.
In terms of the one thing that's going back to the history of white people now, can you give us a bit of a timeline? I touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of the origins
Mhm.
of this Black Sea slave trade. What are the very earliest sources that give us an indication that this existed? And in your mind, how old a tradition is this based on the
Yeah,
evidence that you have amassed?
yeah. Herodotus in the fourth century BC, and he doesn't know when it started. So it's very old. And the Black Sea slave trade didn't come to an end until the Ottomans outlawed it around 1900. So we're talking about something engraved in the history of the Black Sea. Because the Black Sea is so far from the United States, it isn't part of what large numbers of Americans think of as important world history. So for Americans in higher education, they may have a sense of the importance of China and East Asia and Japan, but they probably don't study, say, the history of South Asia or the history of the Middle East as part of relevant background for understanding the United States. It's just too far away. So, for instance, one of the difficulties of getting Americans to understand the Second World War is that for the Nazis, the inferior peoples um, to be exterminated and their land taken over for Germans were to the east, to the Slavic areas. So for the Nazis, Slavs were kind of the equivalent for Americans of Black people or Native Americans. But because Slavs and Eastern Europe and Central Europe are so foreign to the way many Americans think about history, it's hard to understand the Second World War. That is
Mm.
to say, to understand the passions of the Second World War.
I mean, that is very complex, and that brings it into very recent history.
Mhm.
I mean, strictly speaking, if the Black Sea slave trade wasn't officially abolished until around 1900, and that's around the same date that I got as well from other sources.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
wouldn't does that make it the last slave trade to be officially abolished?
Depends on what you mean by officially, and it depends on how big trafficking has to be a slave trade. So, for instance, we know that human trafficking still occurs. The United States Congress outlawed it in the 90s and then reinforced that. So, human trafficking still exists. And I have read reports, and this is anecdotal, of people being sold into servitude, that is, enslaved, around the areas like in Libya or the
Mm.
Spanish Sahara, or places where masses of poor people bump up into each other trying to get to Europe or the United States. And so there are tons of people who are in want and who need some way of feeding themselves. And I mentioned several times before very poor people who sell their children because that's the only source of exchange they can. And if you are hundreds and thousands of people sort of warehoused in these areas, people can come in and scoop up people and sell them. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see an alarm over slave trades related to refugees.
On that subject of people selling their children, there
Yeah.
is, it does seem that there's, when it comes to the Black Sea regions, we have quite a lot of textual support for that practice being
Mhm.
quite common.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, we don't, or at least I'll ask you, is there evidence that that was happening in Africa at any stage, that people were actually selling their children as a part of
Um,
impoverished, being impoverished? Because I
uh,
just want to know if there's any kind of
yeah, I'm
textual or
thinking,
historical
I
support for it.
mentioned Black American travelers in the 19th and early 20th century. And I think I'm remembering a report from northern Nigeria, which not only had slave markets in town, but it was understood slavery, servitude of children being put into the households of people who were better off. And the children couldn't leave. Were they slaves? Where's the line? So it's clearly unfreedom.
Mm, okay, it's interesting because I in one of just in the bit of research I've done, and this is a view that I've always had actually. I always
Mhm.
kind of looked at slavery as something that exists on a spectrum, so to speak. It's
Mhm.
just a spectrum of labor, really. Where right at
Yeah,
one end you've
yeah.
got people who are well paid,
A
have good
spectrum of
rights, and have freedom.
unfreedom. Yeah,
Exactly. And then at the top
yeah,
end, no freedom. And it's really interesting that you raise the subject of houseboys, because that's the very illustration that I gave.
yeah,
I was like,
yeah,
that's something that's
yeah,
very vivid to me, because I've
yeah,
been in that environment. I've seen that, and I've seen
yes,
houseboys
yeah,
or house girls who are very well treated, have good
yeah,
freedoms, are well paid.
yes,
But I've seen ones on the other end of the spectrum who are extremely poorly treated,
yeah, yeah,
abused. I've seen them abused in
yeah,
front of me,
yeah, yeah,
and the way they're treated resembles slavery. That to me, that's a strong
yeah,
if this person has
yeah,
no freedom and you're allowed to
yeah,
abuse them, and that's
yes,
starting to
yes,
sound like
yeah,
slavery. And I've
yeah,
even seen similar systems in the Middle East, etc., when
yes,
I've spent some time in the
yes,
Middle East and lived there.
yes,
So you've
yes,
got this, and I think Ehud Toledano speaks about a continuum as well. So this
yes,
idea that it's not this kind of like hard cut-off line
right, right,
between, this is slavery and this isn't. It's a
yeah.
continuum. Would you?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right about the continuum, and we can put it this way, like you definitely cannot leave, and you can leave and go get a better job. And then there's the other way in which this the economics of the society. So, for instance, in the American South in the 19th century, um, and in New York State, actually, also in the 19th century, before 1827, we're talking about chattel slavery, in which people functioned as property. So, for instance, if you owned a person and you went out and you had a good time and you played the slots and you lost money, you could sell a person to settle your debts. I mean, this is the reason that Thomas Jefferson didn't free his people except for his wife and her children. No, her children, not his wife. That is Sally Hemings. because he was so deep in debt, he needed them as collateral. And one of my former students, his first book was about people as financial instruments. So that's another way of seeing a financial system in which people play a part. So, for instance, could you buy your freedom? In some states you could, and in some states you couldn't. Um, was your unfreedom uh, term limited? And that was most of the unfreedom in the 17th century, indentured. So you worked for a certain amount of time and then you could go live your life. Um, if you were enslaved, could you hire out your own time? Sometimes you could, and sometimes. So there are all these different ways of parsing unfreedom. So I agree with you entirely that to think of slavery as kind of a toggle on and off switch is is not enough.
You, in one of your lectures, I kind of want you to expand on this a bit actually, because this is a really important, interesting point for me. You spoke about the position. I think you was talking about African American studies and Africana studies, and the recency of scholarship, for want of the better word, in the Black community. And so, essentially, I might be phrasing this wrong, but the settled kind of white Europeans had a period of time where their scholarship was largely kind of like only them doing any writing, and
Oh
by the
yeah,
time by the time African American studies was set up, obviously they've been doing it for a long time, and so
hmm
seemed seems smaller, so to speak, and more recent. Could you expand a little bit on that phenomenon? Because when you said it, that was like, oh, that's a, of course,
yeah,
that's why we don't have a massive, library, so to speak, or at least
yeah.
one that's comparable.
Um, in the 20th century, um, in the world of letters, um, ruled by um, elite white men, they could write about anything, and they could write nonsense about anything, and it would circulate. One of the shakings up of African American studies and the rise of African American scholars is adding to those who have permission to say what is truth. I mean, white scholars in African American studies, there's still plenty of white scholars in African American studies, plenty of white scholars winning prizes and getting professorships and so forth. But they're not the only thing now. Just as there's a field of women's studies which didn't exist. And there are men writing, no, let me take that back. I'm not sure. But certainly, the rise of women's studies meant opening up the intellectual arena for women writing, women being published, which in the mid 20th century it happened, of course, but it was rare compared to the later 20th century and the current time.
Okay. So
So it
what's your,
means that more of us get time at the microphone.
which is, yeah, which is great.
Mhm. Yes.
What would you say has been, and I know you're probably, I might not get an answer from you for this, but I'm going to ask anyway. What would you say has been your seminal work to this point?
Oh gosh. Uh, it depends on which market you're talking about. And I use market because when you talk about books, you're talking about who buys what and how many. So my narrative history, Creating Black Americans, is a very steady seller. Um, the book I published last year, I Just Keep Talking, which you see is a good title. I Just Keep Talking landed on lists of the best books of 2024 for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and for the Kirkus Reviews. So that book has done very well. Um, it's out and around in the world. The book that people tell me they love is Golden Art School. Um, the book that is now in its third edition is Standing in Armageddon. It's the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that book is a fixture in AP history high school classes. So it depends on who you're talking to um, and what goes. My favorite book, I've always said, is The Narrative of Hosea Hudson. His life as a Negro communist in the South. It's my second book. I thought for many, many years that my first book, Exodusters, Black Migration to Kansas after Reconstruction, had disappeared. But from time to time, people tell me that it's been very important for them because it's about um, post Reconstruction. So when I wrote it, it was my dissertation. I thought I was writing about long ago history. But what has happened in the United States with right wing terrorism and backlash against Black civil rights, um, that book being post Reconstruction about people fleeing terrorism now seems timely, unfortunately, seems very timely. So people come up to me and tell me they cherish that book as well. Um, Sojourner Truth is now in its second edition, so it's a perennial. The only one of my books that's been a New York Times bestseller is The History of White People.
And that's the one that didn't get any prizes, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah, right, yeah.
Obviously, and that's obviously the book that introduced me to your
Yes,
work.
yes, yes.
Have you is do you get that a lot from that book? Because it sounds like it's, I mean, a New York Times bestseller. It's a very far-reaching book. Who,
Yeah,
what is the market? Because I'm interested to know, what does the market for that book look like? Since you spoke
yeah.
about markets.
Yeah, I don't know because that is a Norton book and I am no longer a W. Norton author. If we ever do a second edition, which I would like to do actually, then the sales figures and its market reach would be something we'd have to look into. But since I mentioned the word market, I want to keep that in mind. And I want you to keep that in mind as you make generalizations about who is reading, what is the reach, where can your work find its readers. It's a question of market because, well, I am a trade book writer, and the first question for trade is what is the market? So it could be a book that walks on water, but if it doesn't seem as if there would be thousands of people putting down money for it, it will not be published by a trade publisher. We have academic publishers, that is, university publishers, and they have traditionally done solid scholarship that will not reach a large audience. Something that has happened in the last quarter century is that as trade publishers concentrate more on bestsellers, blockbusters, that so I am not a blockbuster writer. I'm a mid-list writer. Um, and so, well, actually, I Just Keep Talking is a trade book. Um, Olden Art School came from an independent publisher in Berkeley, not a New York publisher. And then the books before that, New York trade publishing. But academic presses have been moving into that sort of neglected niche now. So you will find books reaching a trade market
Mm,
published by university presses, like the Princeton University Press, for instance. So the market has changed in the last quarter century. There's
mm,
much more openness for books by Black writers, by writers of color, by women writers, by gay, lesbian, and trans writers. So the reach, um, so the market is more open than it was a quarter century or half a century ago. So there's no anybody can write anything and anybody can publish anything. You may
mm,
have to self-publish it, but self-publishing is a time-honored tradition.
mm. It is indeed. Um, Timbuktu comes to mind.
Okay.
Fantastic. Speaking of self publishing, my book is now available for pre sale on Kickstarter. Link in the description. Stay tuned to the end to view the full pitch. I'm actually really happy with what we've discussed so far. Was there anything that
Yeah,
you want to talk
yeah.
about?
Um, well, I think you've done a really good job of getting to the things that are on my mind and of issues around the history of white people. I will add one thing. Yeah.
Mm,
The hardest thing for American audiences has been to understand the concept of more than one white race.
mm,
Over and over and over again, I found people who had read the history of white people still wanting to talk about one white race from
mm,
antiquity to the present. They want the ancient Greeks to be one, to belong to one big white race. They
mm,
want the Anglo Saxons and the Southern Italians to belong to the one big white race. And so I've had to say over and over again that the concepts are rooted in time.
One of my webcams
Oh,
overheated, so I've had to switch
yeah.
over to this horrible
Okay.
one.
Yeah, you look very different now. Okay,
Oh
now it looks like
no.
you're outside in front of a nightclub. Oh, yeah. Um,
Oh
but
no.
the idea of one big white race comes after the Nazis to say that no, there is not a Jewish race.
Mm,
Is one big white race is partly a response to anti-Semitism, murderous anti-Semitism,
mm,
uh, and so that's one thing to understand that, say, the Irish Americans or the Italian Americans or the Jewish Americans, they didn't become white. They were always white. The adult men could vote, um,
mm,
but they were thought to belong to inferior white races, plural.
mm. That's really interesting because in my field. I'm one of the things that I've had to contend with, and this is more. I study quite ancient Egypt quite a lot, and
Yes, I see.
very interested. Oh, okay, good, good. One of the things that I've had to contend with, and I think everyone in our field, Sheikh Anta Diop being the original, is
Yes.
the problem of the ever expanding white race.
Ah.
And it's
Oh, yeah,
so
yeah, yeah, yeah,
interesting.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and it's so interesting
yeah.
when I read your book that, or at least heard your lectures and read your book. The Caucasian has been this very catch-all term that
Yes.
has been the
Yes.
bane of people trying to get an honest outlook on history, because like the
Yeah,
Caucasian race is this
yeah,
all-encompassing thing,
yeah,
which sometimes
yeah.
includes Black Africans when they want it to.
Sure, reaching, well, certainly reaching way up the Nile.
Yeah, definitely. So this idea, this ever expanding idea of the white race
Yeah.
growing and shrinking where appropriate.
Yeah.
These definitions that don't seem to have any fixed jurisdictions. Is this
That's true. They
yeah.
don't, but because they serve a purpose. They're not there
Mm,
of sort of science freewheeling. They serve a purpose, and the purpose was to prove white supremacy.
mm. Um I kind of it has led me down the line. I want to ask you some more questions
Mhm.
just about because I do think there's such an interesting conversation to be had just around um, the reception of challenging ideas and those different groups and how they respond to it. Because this is something I contend with every day. And obviously, this
Yeah,
is something because you don't hold your, you clearly contend with in the work that you do. Um, are you ever surprised by where the contention's coming from, or is it always what you
yeah,
expect?
yeah, I am. I am surprised. I think, how can such a smart person have such a dumb idea? This crosses my mind from time to time, and sometimes about my very own self. Um, so yeah, and you do. I don't spend all my time going around thinking, what do people think? So, people come, you have conversations, and sometimes the conversations reveal what seems to me astonishing ignorance
Mm,
or bigotry. Um, I think one of the greatest vexations I ran into recently with well-intentioned Black people is they're wringing their hands about why Black people don't know X, Y, or Z. As if Black people, I mean, how many are we? What, 40 million people?
yeah.
And and I say, well, who do you mean? And they say, well, Black people. You know, as if we all went in March step, agreeing with one
Yeah.
or another's generalizations. The the readiness of very well educated, thoughtful people to generalize about Americans, about Black people, about Democrats. That always puzzles me, and I find it very tiresome,
Mm,
um, because we are millions of people. We're millions
yeah.
of people, and time and place. I split my time between um, northern New York State, the Adirondacks, and New Jersey, which are very different places. The
Mm,
Adirondacks is rural. It's the oldest state park, maybe in the United States, but certainly in New York. It's big, and it's mixed use. So part of it is like my house. My husband and I own it, but we are in a larger park that's owned by the state of New York, and it's overwhelmingly white.
mm,
It's rural and it's overwhelmingly white. In New Jersey, we live in both places. We live in an Essex County. We live in Essex County, New York, and Essex County, New Jersey. In New Jersey, we live in a tightly packed state, um, the second or third most diverse state in the unions. We've got all kinds of people. I love New Jersey. Um, and my memoir, Old in Art School, was really a hymn to New Jersey. Um,
mm,
so it's very different. And for they work in different ways. So when I'm in New Jersey, I tear my hair because I can't find time to do my work.
mm,
Here, there's much less distraction, and it's also cooler. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, so I grew up in a cool place. I don't like heat and humidity, so I have always since the 70s, since the 80s. Yeah, since the 80s, spent my summers in the north, in the cool north.
Mm.
Um, One of the things that I find tiresome about Americans is the imposition of identity tests, whether wanting to know where I taught or where my degree is from, uh, what kind of Black person I am, how
Mm.
long have I been coming to Martha's Vineyard? You know, it's all these tests that it's very
Mm.
tiresome. And there are just fewer people up here to impose them. I mean, fewer people.
Mm.
Yeah. I thought of something else too. Um, that we both talked about our frustrations about the tyranny of Africa over more recent identities. And I
Mm.
think of myself as a Creole American.
Mm.
Um, Maybe it's because I actually have lived in Africa and I know how different a place and people they are. And
Mm.
also, as a historian, the importance of history in making our identities. So,
Mm.
um, to make Africa a central part of my identity has never been important. And I think what I'm doing, I know what I'm doing in my new book on Sojourner Truth is concentrate on her as a New Yorker,
Mm.
not as an African descended person. In
Mm.
several parts of the book, I'm addressing the concern that my readers will have wanting her to be an
Mm.
African American. So
Mm.
I talk about that. So, for instance, in the 1830s, as she started making her public persona at camp meetings, she was a gifted speaker and singer, and at camp meetings. So I say, is there something we can see that's African in her strength, in her popularity? And I say, probably there was something, but I can't know.
Mm.
And what people talk about and what she talks about are her beliefs, not her Africanness.
Mm.
Um, and then early, maybe it's in the first or second, the first chapter, it's just called Birthing Isabella. It's about her being born. Where is Africa in this? Because I know that some of my readers will want me to address that and will want
Mm.
her to be an African American, where I'm saying she's a New Yorker from Ulster County.
Mm. Well, it's definitely on brand for you because it's going
Yeah,
to
so we'll
challenge a
wait
lot
and
of
see. We'll
people.
wait and see what
Yeah,
people have to say and
yeah,
know
yeah.
there will be pushback.
I, you know, it's one of the things where we touched on it a little bit earlier in our conversation, and it's this pigeonholing
Mhm.
of what people's expectations are of what you're going to output. So, for
Yeah,
instance, obviously we've discussed the fact that I do the ancient Egypt content and I look at lots of different areas, and because of that,
yeah,
people instantly feel like I'm going to be a Pan Africanist, which I am.
huh,
I'm
yeah,
also very respective of what you've just said there, the fact that there's a unique experience going on in all of the diasporas.
yeah,
There's unique experiences going on
yeah,
that absolutely have to be respected. And when I've said previously that I totally understand if an American, for instance, a Black American, doesn't feel any connection to Africa, because there has
mhm.
to be a point where you say, well, at what point does someone become indigenous to their
Right.
land? You know,
Yeah,
we can't,
yeah.
and
Do you speak
if
a
you're looking at,
language spoken in
yeah,
Africa? Yeah, English.
it's like, at what point do you acknowledge that
Yeah.
perhaps this person ancestrally has been here longer than everybody else.
Yeah.
So
Native,
why are
not
they
native
still
people.
attached
Yeah.
to a
Yeah.
separate land?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know.
Because we know that identity is not
Mm,
about your genes. It's not about something that lasts physically over the generations. It's
mm,
about the society you're circulating in. It's about culture. And
absolutely.
that's what makes us people. Culture is what
Mm,
makes us people, but also culture depends on the time and the place and the
mm,
people, the demography. Are you in a rural area? Are you in a city? Are you in a hot place or a cool place? Are you by the sea or on the mountain? Are there a whole bunch of people around you who say, these are my people? Or are you there by yourself? I mean, this
mm,
is one reason why somebody like James Baldwin speaks to so many Americans because
mm,
he had so many experiences, demographic experiences,
mm,
and that he thought of in terms of identity and was so um, eloquent about
mm,
voicing what so many of us do feel or have felt. And that makes him
mm.
a classic writer. If he had had all those experiences and hadn't put them into words, and those words hadn't been published, he would not be the James Baldwin we know.
Mm.
So there are many steps, and many of those steps involve publication.
Which is what you're doing. So
And what you're doing too.
absolutely, yeah, yeah. No, thank you. I always say that I'm, you know, it's a journey, and I'm walking in very much the foundations that have been laid, like just
Mhm.
like you. And so I'm always very grateful, and I'm also very open about when something's been groundbreaking knowledge. I'm a bit obsessive, so obviously since your book, I've gone down a rabbit hole. Books you'll probably be
Yeah.
familiar with: Giles Milton, White Gold, that Most Precious Merchandise by Hannah Barker. Have you seen that one before?
Uh, mhm.
So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I just find that subject in particular just fascinating. And it's weird because I thought everyone would feel, you know, you think that everyone's going to feel the same way as you. I
Yeah.
found it weirdly
Uh,
enough
yeah.
empowering.
Yeah. But everybody's not going to feel the same as you.
No,
I want to give you an
exactly.
example. Um, writing this book about Sojourner Truth. Uh, Before she became Sojourner Truth, she lived in Ulster County, upstate, by the Hudson River, and she was enslaved. Her son was illegally trafficked into the South, and
Mm,
she had to use the law to get him
wow.
back. And this was a big deal in 2022 when the actual documents, physical documents, were discovered in the New York State Archives. It was a big news story. Wow, Sojourner Truth used the law to get her son back. And I read people who said, oh, she was the first Black woman to use the law. Oh, she was the first Black person to use the law. She was the first uh, formally, and off and on.
Mm,
And then, as you say, you go down the rabbit hole. You think, oh, well, let me find out. And it
mm,
turns out there were thousands of enslaved people who used the law.
mm,
And once, I still use the Princeton University Library, and the librarians have been very helpful. And so, they found all these sources where there are books about this. Uh, if you were an enslaved person and you needed to use the law, you didn't
mm,
say, I am an enslaved person. I cannot use the law. I cannot read and write. I have no rights. I am chattel. I, I won't even try. No, thousands of people said, I need to get my kid back. I
mm,
need to get my wife. I need to get my, And so you needed to have an ally who was
Mm,
not a Black person. You needed to have an ally who knew the law. So
mm,
this could not be just a Black person thing. But to start with, you needed to be a person who thought that your family was important enough for you to put yourself out and make the attempt. It didn't always work,
mm,
but to think about this phenomenon of people using the law means that we have to know that some people tried it, thousands, and that they had to have allies who were not Black and who were
mm,
not enslaved. So we have to realize the importance also of allyship. So this becomes a much larger history,
mm,
both in terms of ordinary people's empowerment,
mm.
ordinary people saying, I have human rights. I mean, even if I stop right there, that's a really big deal.
Massive
And
deal.
then and then add in, I have allies.
Mm.
And
That's
also you have to be in a state
mm,
in which the law had a place for that kind of.
mm.
It would be very hard to do that because the laws were so repressive.
You know, yeah, that's got me thinking about a lot because this is once again going back to this discussion around narratives that are allowed to perpetuate sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like sometimes certain narratives are even inflated and fabricated. And maybe this
Of
goes
course.
back to that white man's playground that we were talking about, where they could
These
just
are
say
power
anything
dynamics.
about
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So you've got this inflation and kind of over exaggeration of what's taken place that we've all inherited and said this is
right,
exactly how it
right,
happened.
right.
And then on the flip side of that, and this is something that I touched on, which I think some people got, some people didn't, and I'd love to get your view on it. But something I touched on is the post-slavery narrative. And
Mhm.
this was I've read a book. Well, I mean,
Wait,
haven't read
wait.
it.
When you
This
say
is a
the
long book.
post-slavery narrative, do you mean a narrative that arose after emancipation or a narrative about the period after
The
emancipation?
latter, the latter,
Okay.
the latter. Thank you for asking. So I'm in. I haven't read it cover to cover yet, but I've got a lot from it and read a few of his lectures. I got a book called Sundown Towns by James
Oh,
Lowe.
yes. Yes. Yes.
I'm glad you're
Yeah.
familiar.
Yeah.
And to me, this is an example of a completely suppressed area of history, but that's
Yeah.
had, in my view, a substantial impact and needs to be talked about as
Right.
much
Yes. Yeah.
as the that period of enslavement. This
Yeah.
is really important because these are
Yeah.
people who've created towns and
Right.
cities
You're right.
that have had it taken from them without any compensation.
Right.
And that has
Right.
been stricken from the historical record almost completely,
Right.
or at least not even recorded in many cases.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and yeah, I guess just on the back of what you were just saying then, it just
Mhm.
highlighted to me the fact that certain narratives, everyone is okay with, not saying black or white, but I'm saying everyone is okay with certain narratives being inflated. We're okay with black people being enslaved, having no rights, just being a total object, and who
No,
just
we're not okay with that. We
we're
are
not
not
okay. But I
okay
guess,
with that.
but we're accepting of it. It's just the narrative that everyone is just, oh
That
yeah,
it
they were
existed.
treated like animals and
Yeah.
blah blah blah. They
Yeah.
had no rights. But then there's this hidden narrative which you've just revealed of the fact that no, actually, there were. This is a little bit more nuanced than that. There are people
Yeah.
who are
But
engaged in the legal
wait,
system.
wait,
There's
wait, wait, wait.
perhaps gone.
What I use to find out what I just told you is
Mm,
not hidden because I'm using books that have been published.
mm,
It is not. widely circulated. Now,
Mm.
my book will probably reach more people than those books that I used. And so
Mm.
that idea will circulate more widely. But how are you going to generalize about whether or not the phenomenon of enslaved people using the law is widely known or not, or is known or not?
Mm.
It's known by some people, it's more generally known. I'm uncomfortable with your generalization about what is
That's
known and
fine.
not
Yeah.
known. So, for instance, the Tulsa massacre
Mm.
of 1921 used to not be very well known, even in
Mm.
Oklahoma, or even especially in Oklahoma. But in the early 2020s, a couple of books came out, and the people there never ceased agitating about it.
Mm.
And so, in the last few years, that particular massacre became widely known
Mm.
in the sense that it was covered in national newspapers. And so, I would like to hear in your generalization a criterion about what is known and what is not known. So,
Mm.
a handy rule of thumb is, was it covered in the New York Times? That's just a grosso modo way of knowing whether
Mm.
or not something got out beyond the places involved. In the case of sundown towns, that is
Mm.
something that I was aware of for a long time. My parents
Mm.
were Southerners from Texas, and I read John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom, in the 50s. So I knew about that. My parents knew about that. My parents were educated people, but how many other people knew, I don't know. Certainly
Mm.
the number increased with the book you mentioned. So
Mm.
publication is one way of gauging the
Mm.
circulation of a narrative. But I'm not comfortable with saying nobody knew, or, because that's just too, I
Yeah.
mean, you could say it if we were sitting in a bar
Yeah.
and you were
Yeah.
having your
Absolutely. Yeah.
third martini or something. But
Yeah.
we're having an intelligent conversation here.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Thank you for checking me on my hyperbole. Yeah. Definitely. I think you're right. No. 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 I agree. I agree. I agree. And I guess yeah. Just to I guess to wind that back then. Just to I think to answer your question about the definition, that's where I would probably once again lean on you, because a lot of this it is based on feeling about kind of like I guess there's a difference between, just like you just said there, the stuff that you're going to put in your book is probably going to reach more people than the sum total of people who know about it at the
Yeah.
moment. And then my mind goes straight to, how do people acquire knowledge? And when I say people, I'm not talking specifically about academics whose job
Hmm.
it is to
Yeah. Yes.
research and to uncover these
Yes.
things. I'm talking
Yes.
about just the
Yes.
general population.
Sure.
Why do people have a general base level of understanding about certain headlines
Yeah.
and narratives
Yeah.
regarding slavery, and not about other things? That I guess
Yeah.
that's what I'm
Yeah.
getting at
Yeah.
more than
Yeah.
anything. Trying
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
understand
And those are
the
good questions. And I agree with you about the openness to narrative of the importance of slavery in
mm,
African American history, as opposed to the importance of Jim Crow in
mm,
African American history. And I've not written about the pre-Civil War area, except for around Sojourner Truth. Um, but I agree with you that the narrative of Blackness equals enslavement equals Black history. It's very pervasive. And
Mm,
um, I agree with you about that. But to take a step beyond that, um, for me, I mean, I am a person of the 20th century, so I spent a whole lot of my life during the time of Jim Crow and segregation. So that marked me, and I think I mean, I never was not alive during the early part of the 19th century. So that has marked me. And I know that my sort of unspoken assumptions about what people can do, what Black people, what Black women can do, it's shaped by my own history. And I
mm,
think, just in terms of hair, okay, you can see that this is natural hair. It
mm,
doesn't have color in it and it isn't straightened. Um, as I look at my phone and my laptop, I see Black American women with, and I see all these advertisements about how you can get to this. And I also see white women. How do I get this?
yeah.
Because the picture of women, the acceptable, the widely circulated pictures, visuals of American women is much more this than it was pre-Trump.
Mm,
There's a Trumpy aesthetics that I see all the time in ads on my Instagram feed, for instance. So that has changed a lot. Um, I straightened my hair briefly when I was in art school, um, around 2010, 11, but then I went back. So basically, I've worn natural hair since the 60s, which makes
mm,
me a person of a particular general generation.
mm,
Um, when you talk about how people know what we know, I just mentioned, well, this is what I see on my Instagram feed. And there's a big discussion going on now in the United States about how people know. And the phrase that comes up all the time is social media,
mm,
TikTok as the way of shaping the reality of younger people. Um, so podcasts, YouTube, all of this is very much as we talk and question about how we know what we know. And
mm,
so, one generalization about the MAGA universe, the Trump people make America great again, is that they are um, low information. So, that's a generalization about
mm,
people, whereas we Democrats are people who know everything because we follow everything. So, the question about how you know what you know, that is very much in the air right now in the United
mm.
States.
You've got such a breadth of subject matter for someone who's a quote unquote historian. Um, it feels like you peer into areas of, I don't know, just it's it's like your approach to the book. For instance, I've shown you this book, The Most Precious Merchandise, Mediterranean
Mhm.
Slave. This is
Yeah,
quite similar in terms of content to your
yeah,
book,
yeah.
but your book attempts, well, successfully to do much more.
Hmm.
So do you feel like that's like a um it's almost like that's a as a black scholar
Well, tell me
you almost had
who
gone.
published the other book.
Well, that's a good question. Never look at that before. Penn. It's actually University
Okay,
Press, I think.
so it's a university press book,
Yeah.
and that tells you a lot
Yeah.
about its reach. It tells you that it probably is much more fine-grained than mine because its audience, its market,
Mm,
is scholarly. My market is a general readership market. So if you were someone in the university press marketplace, you
Mhm.
would spend most of your time in my book back in the notes. You'd be crawling
Yeah.
through all the details. And that's what we want, those details in a scholarly book. So we're
Mm,
talking about two different roles in the books as they circulate in the world.
amazing.
It is also a question about, is that the scholar's first book? That makes a
Mm,
difference too. So let's see. History of White People was what, my fifth or sixth book?
mm,
So, you're not comparing the same books, the same publishers, the same
mm.
writers, the same readers.
Brilliant. Well, you've answered that question really well. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for, first of all, deciding that you're going to come on because you didn't have to. So thank you.
You're very
Um,
welcome. I've enjoyed talking to you.
oh, I'm glad.
It's not every day that I get to talk at length with someone who's so well informed as you.
That is a massive compliment. So thank you again. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Like I said, I am very much enamored with your work. I'll be getting some of your latest books as well. And yeah, that Sojourner Truth one sounds very interesting to me. So I don't need much excuse to add new books. I'll definitely be diving in and getting some more of your books. I was writing, I'm not sure if you saw, I know I can go to your website, but I was writing down the books that sounded interesting when you were giving me your
Yeah,
bibliography.
yeah, they're all on their website. They're on the website.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely yeah, no, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. In fact, once again, thank you for your time. What's your plans for the rest of the day?
I'm going to go back to Sojourner Truth. She's still Isabella von Wagenen in New York City. And she is making her way in the camp meetings and talking about the end of the world.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you
All right. Thank you.
so much. Very privileged for your time. So once again, I just want to thank you for doing that for me.
All right.
Okay. Take care.
Bye bye.